looking when you do this? Does it matter?
We're going to start with Brother Brown. Come on.
Hotel, brothers and sisters. I'm Brother Ed, and I have the distinct pleasure this afternoon to introduce the speaker for Black Media, Sister Dupe K. Sais. This is the second time I've had this honor. I'm a member of the Atlanta chapter of ASCAC, and she has spoken to us before in the past. So I do know her. She has a list of credentials that is as long as your arm, and in the pamphlet that she's passed out to us, you can read that for yourself. But I know her as a soldier in the struggle that we as Black people are engaged in at the same in the struggle. She is indeed a true soldier. And she is going to lecture to us this afternoon on how to read African world history. So I'll, at this point, give you Sister Madupe.
Thank you, brother. Hope you won't mind if I sit here more comfortable this way. I'd like to thank also Black Media for this opportunity to share with you some of the information that I have been blessed to have come my way. I have recently republished a selected bibliography of African world history. My mentor and teacher, Dr. Joseph Ben Yakinen, has written a 3-page introduction to it. And so my remarks will be based a lot on the contents of this document, but on other subjects surrounding our history and world history as well. And of course, I will look forward to any questions that you may have. I'd like to start by saying that I was Black History Month a couple months ago to show you how much I think we are in need of discussions like this. Georgia State University, according to the newspapers, invited Terry McMillan to speak for Black History Month at Georgia State University. And when I realized that, I shuddered, because I have a great deal of difficulty understanding what Ms. McMillan has to do with Black history. And what she has written has to do with Black history. And as a matter of fact, it is my sense that once one knows Black history and world history, one can see that there is really no need to write books about the subject matter of Ms. McMillan's works, because once one understands the legacy of African people, African women in particular, we would quickly be able to discover that the subject matter of Ms. McMillan's last book and the subject matter of African women's history in the world bear no resemblance whatsoever to one another. My concern is that 700 sisters, according to the newspaper, turned out to get their copy of Ms. McMillan's book autographed, thinking perhaps that it had something to do with Black history. And so one thought that I'd like to leave you with here today is that we are, I think, in dire need of some in-depth discussion and analysis of what, in fact, constitute Black history and how it differs from the history of European people. The subject matter of Ms. McMillan's last book, Waiting to Exhale, really is no more than a black-faced version of Cosmopolitan magazine, where the image and the character of the women she portrayed bear no real resemblance to African people. I mean, they bear a greater resemblance to European women whose identity is based on what happens in the bedroom. And so with that as an introduction to the need, one of the many examples of how badly we need African history, I'd like to move on. Let me just say this, too, in that same connection. I have just been so shocked, I guess is the word, as to how many of us are reading materials fiction of that type and others, that I sometimes take a little survey on the martyr rail, because I ride the martyr rail a lot, and stop folk who are reading horror stories and other things which have no resemblance to our history and ask why they're reading it. And after they give an explanation, I ask them, do you ever read anything serious? And generally speaking, the answer is no. And so I'm forced again to conclude that given the fact that we have been prevented for centuries from even knowing we had a history, and then prevented beyond that from finding out where to go and read about this history, it's no small wonder that so many of us just pick up anything that's in print for entertainment or for enlightenment. And so my remarks are not intended to berate any personalities, but they're intended more as a commentary on the extent to which we have been deprived of access to information that is of a substantial, nourishing nature. In putting this guide together, I call it an annotated study guide. What I have attempted to do is to draw on the wisdom of our elders in guiding us as to what, in fact, we should be reading. Not everything in print is worth reading, regardless of whether it's written by black folks or other people. And in trying to put together a useful piece, I consulted two main sources, well actually five. I consulted the works of our living African American elder historians, and this book identifies which references in here were recommended by those elders: John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben, Chancellor Williams, John Jackson. I combed through the works of those elders, and I had conversations with several of them, asking what in their opinion were the essential things that our folks needed to read, so that a lot of the study groups that exist, they're wandering all over the map. They pick up anything that has been written about black people and plug that into a study schedule. And I began to wonder, was there a need, in the opinion of the elders, to read some things first? Were there some things that would give us the background and the foundation that we would need to help us understand other kinds of things? Should we be reading any fiction at this point? So this material is an attempt to guide folks who want to develop their own home libraries, or even professional associations that are beginning to do something about Black History Month, so that our reading is not random. And it has come, as I said, largely from the recommendations of those elders. But as a historian myself, I have also over the years begun to add some material which I think that we might not otherwise know about. I have called this a selected bibliography of African world history, because I think it's important that we not make the same mistake that Europeans have made, where they only read about Europe. I think we run a risk of only reading about Africa. And again, the elders teach us that we need to read world history, which also means the history of the European. In the words of Arthur Schomburg, for whom the Schomburg Library in Harlem has been named, he's an African brother of Puerto Rican ancestry whose own personal collection of materials on world history formed the foundation of that library, which is now the greatest resource in the world on the culture of our people. He instructed John Henry Clark when he was a young man and wanted instantly to know all there was to know about the history of black people. He told Dr. Clark then, read first the history of your enemy, then read the history of your own people. Because, as he put it, once a slave knows that his master is unworthy, he is no longer a slave. And so in this bibliography, and in the remarks that I want to share with you today, I have included some very key references on European history that I suspect we might not otherwise stumble on. And I would like to begin my remarks with those as well. I would say, too, before I get underway, that our mental health, I think, is going to be found in our history. We need to see history, I think, as a report of how people have behaved throughout the century. That's really all it is. And we have been blessed with a legacy of having people who have lived the longest on this planet And so we can look at some of the difficulties that we're having now as a people and compare it with how our same people lived years ago, centuries ago, and how other peoples lived centuries ago, and determine, did they have the same problems then that we're having now? And if not, why not? And what was it that prevented that then that we might learn from now? And so we have a family tree that we can go back and trace and see how the family behaved. What kinds of techniques did they use that we might still incorporate? Because the blood still remembers. The trick here was one of mind control to make us believe that there was no other world, no other time, no other model except the one in which we now find ourselves in. And as long as we believe that this is the only way that the world has ever been, we have fallen for a trick that was designed to cut us off from all that has gone before. And the past is very much a part of our present and will guide us toward the future. So with that, let me share with you some authors, the names of some authors and some works that I would want to call to your attention. In particular, I'd like to start with European references written largely by Europeans about their own people, so that that kind of authorship gives an authenticity to stuff and is what I call first-person accounts. When people are writing about their own folk, they have less reason, particularly Europeans, to say something that's not true, even if it's not complimentary. And then I'd like to move into another part of what this bibliography contains, and that's how to find out-of-print books. I'd like to talk just a moment also then about what I call some essential references that you should know about, and then entertain some of your questions. Is that all right? Okay. In this bibliography on page 9, there are a couple of books by an author who you should definitely know about if you don't already. He's a European author. He is professor of history at Yale. His name is John Boswell. And Professor Boswell has written an indispensable book for our libraries and for our study groups, even though the book does not deal with African people, it deals with European people. The title of the book that I want to bring to your attention is The Kindness of Strangers, the abandonment of children in Western Europe from antiquity to the Renaissance. And the book goes on to point out, and I won't get into it in detail, the very drastic ways in which European child-rearing practices differ from pretty much all the child-rearing practices in the rest of the world. In their cruelty, abandonment has been commonplace among European people throughout time, and so the child abuse that goes on here in the United States is really very much in keeping with that tradition. That's perhaps why there's not the great alarm on the part of white people with respect to what's happening to children in this country that there is from our people in many instances, because they have not known a tradition which is very different. Whereas among African people, among Native American people, the child-centeredness of that culture is dramatic. So we need to understand that ours is a very different tradition than the one we find ourselves in. And Boswell's book highlights, perhaps better than any that I know of in contemporary times, what that tradition is like. He also has quite a few references and pictures in there. It's difficult reading, and for those of us who have been accustomed only to getting our source of information from TV, it's rough sledding. But even if you read a chapter a month, you need to be familiar with that as background, because the trick was to make us think that this kind of behavior, child abuse, for example, is universal, and it's not. We have begun to pick up other people's habits because we've lived among them, but we have references even within our own family of other ways of relating to children. There's another reference in here by a Dr. Dover on page 18. Dover's book is a classic on the history of homosexuality as part of Greek culture. It is the classic book on that subject, and it is, I maintain, something that we need to also know the existence of, because I think a lot of the discussion on what is being called multiculturalism really revolves around that issue. As far as I can determine through historical research, the real reason that Europeans have messed over African people was not color at all, but the fact that when Europe invaded the interior of Africa, they discovered that African people were not homosexual. And they had to quickly come up with a rationalization for that, because Greece and Rome are homosexual cultures. And Dover's book is the classic on that subject. There are other references which I will tell you about. And so the rationalization that Europe came up with was that it was y'all, us, who were heathen and pagan and savage and backward and in need of civilizing, which then allowed them to rationalize their own way of life as the norm, as the civilized manner. And that is still, in my opinion, the basis of the argument that Western civilization should still be the pinnacle. And that is why it is taught and has such a central place, in my opinion, today in the universities. So Dover's book is the classic on that subject. Another book on a related subject in this bibliography, I'm giving you just a little annotation about each of these, is a book by Eva Kules, K-E-U-L-S. Eva Kules is a European-American art historian who, in her book, The Reign, R-E-I-G-N, The Reign of the Phallus, P-H-A-L-L-U-S, describes the homosexuality of Greek culture and its hatred of women, and she uses Greek artifacts, Greek vases that have painted on them homosexual acts, and it's a book that, as I said, you would not know a lot about or even hear about, that I wanted to bring to your attention because it serves as a reference point to document the nature of European culture and the ways in which it differs from the cultures of the world. The centrality of homosexual behavior in that culture is considerable. There is also in this bibliography, on that same note, a very classic article by a Mr. Ungaretti. Just find that, here it is, John Ungaretti, who describes in an article called Pederasty, Heroism, and the Family in Classical Greece, this is on page 39 of this book, describes how what today we call molestation of children was the norm, was characteristic even of Greek family life. And again, these are articles that are documented in the journals that you should have as a reference. Okay? Also, on another note, the works of Robert Farris Thompson are ones that you should also be familiar with. Robert Farris Thompson is still living. He is European American, but he's probably the foremost African art historian in the country. An extraordinary individual. He enjoys the greatest respect from African people on this side of the Atlantic and abroad because of the really profound respect that he has developed in his understanding of African culture. He has written a book that should be read by everyone. All of his works, I think, should be read. But probably the book of his that is most available is one called The Flash of the Spirit, which is a discussion of African art and philosophy. And he draws very heavily on what he calls the morality of African people as it is reflected in our art and in our music. He is in awe of African morality, and he has been blessed to be able to identify it as it is reflected in our music and in our art. And if you ever have an opportunity to hear Mr. Thompson in person, drop what you're doing and go. He's about, 6'8", about 250 pounds, red-faced white man, but who has, as I said, probably rare appreciation and respect for our culture, and he is certainly worth hearing. He was at Spelman sometime last year, and there is a Yoruba festival that is held annually in New York, and he is always invited to be there. Okay, thank you. I've been asked to ask if someone was driving a white car. They are blocking the driveway. Okay. Robert Farris Thompson, most of his works are out of print. And when we get to the out of print part of this discussion, I will make some suggestions as to how you can find some of his stuff, because it's really worth owning. Let's see. There is another book in this collection, in this bibliography, by Maria Tatar, T-A-T-A-R. And the title is The Hard Facts of Grimm's Fairy Tales. It's a book you should know about because in the fairy tales, or nursery rhymes, any 2 or 3 fairy tales or nursery rhymes that come to mind, European, that we've read, God knows I read them to my children, Creator forgive me, is drenched in child abuse and violence. And when I discovered it, the more I looked, the more I found that to be true. And then a couple of years ago, the Creator sent this book my way. And so I have included it in this bibliography. And Miss Tata, a Princeton scholar, European American, has written the background to the Grimm's fairy tales. And in it she describes how these were stories written in Europe by 2 bachelor European men, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. And they were not written for children at all originally. They were written as a kind of pornographic adult entertainment for European adults. And they would sit by the fireside in the cool of the evening and kind of share these stories about awful things happening to young people for their entertainment. I can't quite get into how that could be entertaining, but that is the background and the history. And so again, it's important to know about this kind of documentation so that when you hear it, when I speak of it or others, you understand that it's not just running off at the mouth. And you also, again, have a very clear-cut example of how very different the cultures are with respect to children. Anyone who could conceive of that kind of material as entertaining is beyond me. And it also is not too far-fetched from the kinds of violence now that is being promoted as entertainment in some of the movies and some of the cartoons for children, so that there's a tradition of this. And when we seek to do something about it, it helps to know that this just didn't develop overnight, that it's a long-standing, has a long-standing history, and that there are people in this country who will not understand what you're talking about if you find that offensive. And so for African people and African children, it is clear that we must develop our own models which we can draw on from our own traditions. Okay? But with those introductions to the European materials in here, some of them, I'll get to Basil Davidson in another section. Let me move on very quickly to the section in this bibliography that deals with out-of-print materials. I should say also that in many ways, for our people, writing is a backward step, in my opinion. We have been surrounded by so much wonderful literature now that many of us think that if it's not in a book, you can't find it anywhere else. I want to point out that the world existed for a long, long time before there were books, and that there are other ways of knowing and getting information without reading. Richard King, in his book, The African Origins of Biologic Psychiatry, talks about the fact that we have to go to someone else for information is a sign of how ill we have become in this culture. That if we are in proper spiritual equilibrium, The ancestors will come to you and give you the very information that you need. So I'm talking a lot today about books, but I also want to make it very clear that that is by no means a guaranteed source of information, that the central and the most reliable source is that which comes from ancestors. And they don't write books because they don't have to. So there are other ways of knowing, is what I'm saying. Certainly nothing wrong with reading a book, but we need to put published materials in their proper perspective, because in our tradition, words have power. And the tradition is such that you don't speak on some things, or you use discretion in the ways in which you use words, because the speaker bears a responsibility for the consequences of the acts that are created by your vibrations. And so on purpose, we didn't put a lot of things in writing. And that's still good advice as far as I'm concerned. But I want to point out that just because something is in print, we tend to be in awe of it, when words have another whole purpose depending on the culture. We live in a culture that's very talkative. People get real uncomfortable when there's silence. But in the elder cultures, as I call it, Native American, Asian, African, silence is a very cultivated form of communication. Silence in the elder cultures is considered the cornerstone of character, the mother of truth. And so words and talkativeness really are something that we have just begun to be a part of, and doesn't have to be our model, shouldn't be our only model. Let me then talk about the out-of-print books. There are part of this integral part now of the publishing industry, which is devoted purely to out-of-print books. And they're pretty easy to find. If you read, let's say, the New York Times Magazine section on Sunday, New York Times Book Review section on Sundays, next to the last page always has some classified ads, included in which are companies that specialize in out-of-print books. If you are interested in an out-of-print book, what you can do, what I have done, I will write a letter saying what it is I'm looking for. I'm looking for such and such by so-and-so, or I just know the title, I don't even know the author, or I may know the author and the subject, but not the title. I usually run off about 10 copies of this letter, and I send them to about 10 different out-of-print places. I've included in here about a dozen of out-of-print places that you can, I've got 9 out-of-print places that you can write to. These are not the only ones. These are just some that I have dealt with. And I might send that letter for the book I'm looking for to all 9. And I have rarely been disappointed. Usually there's no cost for the search. Some places charge, but they will tell you up front what they charge. And periodically they will come back to you with an answer. Well, we found the book that you were looking for, but it's only in paperback, and a couple of the pages are damaged, and the price is. Usually you are under no obligation to buy it. But this is a resource that you should know about if you are building a library and if you're looking for something in particular, even though it may now be out of print. So if you read other types of magazines that have literary qualities to them, like the New Yorker, literary magazines, you will inevitably find pages in the back of those magazines as well that list out-of-print bookshops. Of course, old second, third hand bookshops, you're also likely to stumble on a book that is out of print that you may have been looking for, but there are bookshops that specialize in finding out-of-print books. One of them is right down here in Little 5 Points, Acapella. You know where that is? On Euclid Avenue. Let me move on then to some essential readings. I have tried real hard without much success in coming up with a top 10 list of must-read books. And I can't come up with just 10 because there are more than 10. But what I'd like to do is to again suggest some that you may not be familiar with, all of which I have put in here, a little description of them for you. And this is not in any particular order, and they contain some by African American authors as well as European people. The first one, again, this is not in any particular order, is Laila Afrika's African Holistic Health. And I put that first on the list because if we aren't healthy, we won't even have the stamina to read anything else. So that I'm putting our health first in that respect. I bought a video here the last time I was here with Dr. Afrikan speaking, and on it he said he was going to be revising this book. But don't wait until the revision comes out. If you haven't read it and you don't own it, get it and put it in your library. It is a treasure, not the least of which is the section he has on there on the history of African health. It's mind-boggling. Very, very worthwhile book. Another goodie in here is a monograph. It's not a book, it's a paper actually, by Reverend Lawrence Alexander, who has given me permission to include it in this bibliography and has given me permission to list his address in here for those of you who want to get a copy of it. Reverend Alexander used to be a Christian minister here in the United States, lives in New York, and took a trip to Kemet with Dr. Ben. And, just like the rest of us, got turned around 360 degrees, so much so that when he went back to his organization, I don't remember the denomination, but he was high up in the administration of that denomination. And he started trying to break down and share with them the impact and the information that he gathered from the trip. And of course they did not want to hear that, and they discovered that furthermore what he was talking about was going to really upset the apple cart, and so they cut him loose. And here he was, man, family, home, secure job, and he understood, he said, when he did what he did, what the risks were going to be, and so he rode with the risks. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful piece that he has written called One Step Higher, where he explains the impact on his trip to Kemet, on his life and his belief systems. And again, fortunately, it's still available, though he wrote it in 1981, and that's described in here. If you're not familiar, is there anyone here who's not familiar with the works of Dr. Ben? If you're not, become familiar with the works of Dr. Ben Yakunu. It's very hard to choose one or two pieces of his works. I once asked him what he thought was his most important book, and he said Black Man of the Nile. They are all rich and important. Of the three that I have chosen to highlight for you, assuming that one day you read them all, are three. One called Chronology of the Bible. Dr. Ben, among other things, is a scholar of world religion, and he has written a tiny, tiny pamphlet that I don't even know is still in print. It's about 10 pages, called The Chronology of the Bible. It may be out of print. For so many years, up until very recently, Dr. Ben published his own materials. And so they would go out of print fairly soon because folks would snatch them up. And good friends were even known to lift copies of Dr. Ben's stuff from other good friends' libraries, So Chronology of the Bible is one that may be reprinted because Black Classic Press now, praise God, has begun to reprint Dr. Ben's works, and this may be on the list. Another of his works is Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, which is now available, again from Black Classics Press. And then a more recent one, Abu Simbel to Giza, which is the guidebook that he has put out for people who want to take the trip to Kemet and need some sort of guide, travel guide, a notebook to record the experiences in as you go about. I'm particularly grateful that he did this because, in my opinion, if you don't go to Kemet with Ben, you're lost. I shouldn't say that, but let me put it another way. If you don't go to Kemet with Dr. Ben, in my opinion, you miss a very valuable experience. I went in '83, and that was his 34th trip, and he knows every blade of grass, every twig, every hieroglyphic, everything. So his experience is very valuable to those of us who are studying. And this guidebook he has put together to help you through the tour. Even with him, I think it's impossible without a knowledgeable person. Certainly he's not the only knowledgeable one, but I would certainly recommend that you go with him if it's at all possible. Stolen Legacy, I'm going to assume, is something that's well known to everyone. That should certainly be read at least once a year by George G.M. James. I know every time I read it, it's a brand new experience. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of Richard King, whose work I'm going to refer to in a moment, the recipe for holistic living, the recipe for recovery, the recipe for restoring our spiritual equilibrium is in George G.M. James' Stolen Legacy. It's not, there's no title in there called, no chapter in there called recipe. But I think if you read it through, you will see what I am talking about. There's a book written by European James Breasted that you should know about and should aim to have in your library. It may be out of print. If it is, you can find it through one of the out-of-print places. I found a hardcover through that out-of-print source, and it's called Dawn, D-A-W-N, of Conscience. And again, it's written by Breasted, who at one time was the United States' foremost Egyptologist. And he talks of Egypt as, I'm sure assuming that Egypt was European, but that's neither here nor there. The value of this book is that he acknowledges that African people in Kemet had a moral code and introduced the whole notion of conscience to the world. And he includes in that book a passage from, I think it is Proverbs, the book of Proverbs in the Bible, and puts an Egyptian text side by side with it, which precedes it by thousands of years, and shows how the Old Testament, or the Torah, really is imitation, good measure, of religious texts and wisdom texts from African people. So Dawn of Conscience is very useful, an important book, I think, to own in any library. I would encourage you to do further reading of the ancient wisdom literature, including the Hosea, which Maulana Karenga has begun to translate, including the teachings of Qatar, which Asa Hilliard and others have put together in a little booklet. Again, I don't know if these are still in print or not. Teaching Batar still is. And then there's a wonderful translation of the book of Coming Forth by Night, Coming Forth by Day. The title is Awakening Osiris. A very poetic translation of it by someone, a woman called Normandie Ellis. And I include that in here as well. If we're not familiar with the Nigerian author Chinwezu, I would strongly recommend that you become familiar with him, particularly his book called Decolonizing the African Mind, where he gets into a whole discussion of what significance to African people are the Olympics and the Nobel Prize and Academy Awards and those kinds of things. Very important, brother. A must. Sorry, his name is Chinwezu. Chinweizu. You're very welcome. Another must book is Sheikh Anta Diop's Cultural Unity. Again, another book that ought to be read at least once a year. Difficult reading. Even more difficult for those of us for whom TV has turned our brain to jello. Real rough reading, but here he lays down a thesis that helps us to understand the fundamental difference in character between what he calls the northern cradle people and the southern cradle people. Very important reading. Another book, basic text on African history, is John Jackson's Introduction to African Civilization. Brother Jackson must be nearing 100 years old. Last call, he's still alive, and his vision and his scholarship has been so formidable that nobody wanted to publish him up until very recently, and it was through the intervention of John Henry Clark that Macmillan published John Jackson's Introduction to African Civilization. It's a masterpiece, just pure and simple. Particularly his chapter on Africa and the civilizing of Europe. Richard King is a brother that is one of our natural resources here on this side of the Atlantic. He is one of those extraordinary people who has managed to survive the severe penalties that one must endure in going through Euro-American's graduate school. So he got out of the medical school in America on his feet. And to hear him tell it, the thing that kept him together spiritually and culturally is that he had a whole community of elders who would help him translate the foolishness that he was taught in the schools, would tell him what the real deal was. So he came out whole and came out with an understanding of the world and our people's history in it, which has enabled him to serve us. And he has written a book called The African Origins of Biologic Psychiatry, which is a must. He is an authority on melanin. And his thesis is, in very simple terms, that we have within us as African people access to the ancestral memory. And that to the extent, these are my words, not his, we're able to detox, to identify those things which are alien to us spiritually, alien to us culturally. To that extent, we begin to recenter ourselves and are then able to plug back into the stream of the ancestral stream of consciousness. And this is where he talks about how if we are centered properly, the ancestors will come and give you all the directions and the answers that you need, etc. This is my words, not yours.